So yeah, really nicely, my talk follows on from Paro's talk before, working with a completely different discipline, but looking at the views from the autism community around open data practices. And hopefully there'll be insights here while I'm talking about autism specifically for anyone interested in open research, and particularly those who work with marginalized populations. So I've just got to say a big shout out at the start that I'm presenting today, but this is very much a group effort. I'm part of this informal collective of autism researchers who are interested in open research methods and how they can be applied or may need to be amended for our field. And I've picked up the work as the PI. Hannah Hobson's just gone on mat leave, so I'm just pushing the work over the line now. So any mistakes are my own, but Hannah's really led this work. So a bit of background and context to where we are as a field. So in recent years, researchers have really caught up with discussions that have been going on in the autism community for a while, which relate to really concerns about how autism research is conducted. So it's been pointed out that researchers have contributed to stigmatizing ideas around autism in the public domain, and they've emerged through theories which have been said to be dehumanizing, and also widespread use of ableist language in the field. There was also some pioneering work from Liz Pellicano 10 years ago, which looked at the views of the autism community around research and found that people were very dissatisfied, where despite this vast amount of spending on autism research, there was very little tangible evidence of impact in people's everyday lives. And also followed up, I used to work here in Manchester, some work led by Emma Gowan, where we talked to autistic people about their views around research, and there's real evidence of low trust in autism researchers and their motivations. Now, these issues have really come to a head fairly recently with a particular episode, which is Spectrum 10K. So Spectrum 10K was a proposed research study in which researchers aim to collect physical mental health data plus DNA samples from a very large sample of autistic people, 10,000 people. So this would have been the largest ever piece of autism research. What happened is, shortly after the study was announced, a protest movement formed against the work called Boycott Spectrum 10K. The activists had quite a number of concerns about the ethics of this research, but a particular interest to us today is that there was they noted that the consent forms for the study had a mandatory data sharing agreement for participation. Very shortly after launching, the study had to be paused, and the researchers were doing community consultation. And just earlier this year, it was finally announced that the study had been cancelled and wasn't going to go ahead. There's quite a lot for us to learn as a field from this whole episode. But one thing that we noted within our group was just thinking about how open research practices have moved forward so rapidly in recent years, but something that was perhaps generally missing is the perspectives of the participants around the practices that we use. So this links to a talk from yesterday from Ellen Polyakov, where perhaps the situation is changing a bit and researchers are starting to explore what our participants think. So what we were interested in was what the autism community think about open data. So for this work, we recruited 30 participants to a set of interview studies. So we recruited 16 autistic adults, and we also recruited the parents of autistic children as well. So the rationale for including both parents as well as autistic people is that in autism research, parents are often the ones who make decisions about consenting to take part and about data sharing on behalf of their children. We recruited through our local participant databases, but also we had the support of a national charity, Autistica, who helped us with recruitment. The benefit here was we were able to try and reach a more diverse sample than might be included in our existing participant databases. So particularly, we were interested in whether there were factors which might influence people's perceptions of open data. For instance, whether the participants were from minoritized ethnic groups or around their previous experience in research before. So overall, the autism community, I would reflect, are quite research literate, but we assumed that the general participants in our studies probably didn't spend ages thinking about how data might be shared. So before participants took part in the interview, we shared a short video with them in which we talked a little bit about what open data is, and also a bit of a description about the kinds of different access restrictions you might find around open data. Following this, the participants took part in a semi-structured one-to-one interview where they talked about their views on open data, some of the possible positives and risks, and some contextual factors as well, which might shape their decision-making. So we used a type of qualitative analysis called thematic analysis, which is an interpretive form of qualitative data analysis. We actually pre-registered this analysis, and because we were motivated by that Spectrum 10K study and this background from the field, we were actually quite interested, we pre-registered that we would be sensitive to power dynamics in participant statements. So because this is an interpretive form of analysis, just important to highlight positionality. So this was really, we collaboratively coded and analyzed the data here, and collectively we are a neurodiverse research team. We come from quite a wide array of different methodological backgrounds, and then that's also reflected in our experience and perceptions around open research practices. One thing that we all have in common is that to different extents we all use participatory approaches in much of our research. So that means including autistic people in the whole research pipeline. So before I go on to the themes, just to give a bit of an oversight of the general views that were being expressed here, the majority of our participants did see value in open data, and I'll talk about more of that in a second. But the clear preference expressed was that there would be access restrictions when data is made openly available. So I won't go through this entire quote, but just to give you the gist, really participants were talking about wanting to retain some insight into who was accessing data they'd contributed to research studies. So the key themes that emerged in our analysis were narratives of research and vulnerability and risk in research participation. Now, something that the participants discussed within both these themes cutting across was how narratives and risks were really experienced at the individual level, but also thinking about the sort of collective, the community level as well. Okay, so the first theme is around the narratives surrounding research. And this is where participants really did, they were invested in the idea of research as a potential tool for good, and also as open data as something which could really improve the efficiency of autism knowledge and could be empowering for autistic people when implemented appropriately. However, there were concerns around how narrativization could emerge through open data. So that is, they saw the interpretations of research data as where power could be exercised. And what they're really talking about here is how there were concerns that participant might consent to a study. The data is then made openly available, but the participant no longer has any control over who can access that data, how it will be interpreted, and it may be far beyond the scope of the study they had actually consented to take part in. So illustrated by this quote here, there may become a point at which the original purpose becomes kind of diluted and bastardized. I mean, yeah, I would really like things to be open, but if life's taught me anything, it's not to be so gullible. Check that people can actually be trusted. So moving over to the second theme, this was more about the individual level, the risks that were associated with openly available data. And the key risk here related to re-identification from open research data. Participants reflected that openly available data they might be identified from. They were expressing concerns about potential backlash about any data they might have contributed to a study that was then openly available. Or also, if they were re-identified from some data, they might be put in a position where they were forced to disclose their autism diagnosis in a way that they didn't have any control of anymore. Participants also reflected on different factors which might shape vulnerability in this situation. So, for example, many participants talked about how in the period after receiving an autism diagnosis, they were really desperate for information and might be inclined to take part in studies and consent to work that they might then over time reflect that they wish they hadn't participated in. So again, here, given by this quote, I think that was just after I was diagnosed and I was feeling desperate for something and to be involved in. And I did it, and then I thought, oh dear, my data is already out there. So this participant is reflecting afterwards that they consented to their data being made openly available in this moment of really wanting to find out more about being autistic, and later came to regret that. Participants also considered another way in which they considered themselves to be vulnerable was through lacking information lacking information from participant information sheets and consent forms, which would then disempower them from making really fully informed consent about having their data shared. So as highlighted here, this participant is talking about how information sheets are a bit obscure and difficult for participants to really understand, even if they can read and understand the individual, what is actually written there. Something that really emerged from these interviews was that through that process of having a discussion and having been presented with some of the different access restrictions which could be associated with open data, participants really changed their mind as they really had an opportunity to think about some of the implications of making different kinds of data available. Okay, so overall, given the context in which this research has taken place, we were actually quite surprised by how positive participants were about autism research and also their positive views about the idea of making data openly available. However, there were some key considerations which we should take forward from this work. So firstly, it does seem that overall, the preference expressed here was for restricted access models of open data. So for instance, such as that offered by the UK Data Service, which offers information for researchers which can guide decision-making, and also a tiered access restrictions model around open data. So yeah, another reflection is that we originally intended to make all the data from this study openly available. After doing this work, we've opted for a restricted access model, which we have then member checked with the participants in the study, and they agree with this. Another consideration is that we need to make consent forms more accessible so participants are more informed in their decision-making around open data. Now, moving forwards, we want to move towards more ethical open autism research practices. And so it'd be really good to look at processes for co-producing open data processes. kind of things we're thinking about here are participants leading on developing resources which can guide researchers' decision-making based around their preferences. Also looking at, as I mentioned before, participant-facing materials which are properly accessible, which can explain more about open data. But also maybe trying to understand what possible models for consent, for data reuse, and whether there are opportunities for community-led governance over open data might be something that's possible. Finally, I have a reflection that it'd be quite useful as well for some more empirical meta-research in the field as well. So in autism research, how is open data actually being used? Are we realizing the benefits? Are researchers making use of open data, or the community making use of this data that we're putting up there? But also on the negative side, are any of these concerns, these worries about re-narrativization, are they actually happening? If we could try and get to the bottom of this a little bit more, this could help guide some of this decision making. Okay, so finally, thank you to the participants in this study and the research team. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for a really interesting talk. So we do have some time for questions if anyone has any. Yeah, there's one right up at the back there. Just bear with our robe. I think it's good to get the mic just in case.
Okay, thank you for that question. So your question there was about whether there's something special about genetic data, because that was something that came up in the Spectrum 10K work. And so we did expect that this would be the case, and that we looked at different types of data. We explicitly talked participants through this. So I would say overall, my experience of interacting with autistic people in the autism community is there's often a degree of concern around genetic research, because there's this fear that identifying individual or the genes that might lead to people being autistic is then going to lead to the way it's seen as potentially eugenics of autistic people. So it's something that people are very concerned about. However, in this study, we did go through a discussion about, like, what do you think about different kinds of data? And participants didn't really express overall very strongly different views for very different types of data about data sharing. So it was more of an overall, there was like a positive view about all different types of research and different types of data. But as long as these sort of safeguards and protections were put in place, they were quite positive about research, like quite broadly there.
Any other questions? I think we've got time for one more. Anyone's got one?
Yeah, I have one myself. So hello, everybody. My name is Saida. I'm a third-year medical student, so I'm really sorry if my question has a very obvious answer. But what does it mean when you say you identify power dynamics? What kind of power dynamics are present?
Okay, that's a great question. So what power dynamics are present in the data? So we were explicitly trying to look for how power is negotiated around knowledge, because really when we're doing research, it's like a form of knowledge generation around autism. And so researchers have a sort of privileged position in this regard, and that is being challenged when we do participatory research, so involving autistic people as well, and looking at how autistic people's understandings and experiences of autism, that's another form of knowledge there. And so through the Spectrum 10K situation, we're seeing this real shift in a power dynamic where a research study has been upended by activists. So what we were doing there was specifically looking for where participants were talking about power and where they were feeling disempowered through their involvement in research or losing control over the data. But also similarly, some components I didn't actually get into here, where they could have power themselves. So for instance, not taking part in research studies which weren't aligned with their views, or consenting for data being shared in those kinds of situations either.